You stand on the salt-warped planks of a colonial dock, wrists chafed raw by iron manacles that have already decided your fate. The air tastes of tar and rotting fish. Behind you, a crowd gathers, merchants in wool coats, sailors with gaps in their teeth, children perched on crates to see over their mothers' shoulders. They've come for theater. They've come to watch a woman die. But here's the paradox that will haunt you through every breath you have left. The system that will kill you this morning never actually needed proof you were guilty. It needed proof that women could be punished. The trial was yesterday. It lasted 90 minutes. The sentence was written before you spoke a word in your defense. Before we go further, I need to ask you something. If you're fascinated by the dark corridors of history where power, gender, and violence collide, hit that like button right now. And drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I'm constantly amazed that people from Manila to Manchester, from Lagos to Los Angeles, gather here to unearth these forgotten stories together. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're about to step into a world where justice wore a noose and mercy was a word that died at sea. The woman on that dock isn't fictional. She's composite stitched together from trial records, prison ledgers, and execution broadsides that survive in archives from Jamaica to the Old Bailey. Her name might have been Rachel or Catherine or Maria. It doesn't matter. What matters is that between 1650 and 1730, dozens of women stood exactly where she stands now, and the empire that condemned them wasn't interested in their stories. It was interested in making examples. Let's talk about what happened when the age of sail collided with the age of patriarchy, and women who dared to live outside the margins found themselves caught between the sea and the scaffold. To understand how female pirates were tortured and executed, you first need to understand the legal machinery that made it possible. This wasn't mob justice. This was bureaucracy with a blade. The foundation was laid in 1698, when King William III signed an act for the more effectual suppression of piracy. It did something revolutionary and terrifying. It extended admiralty jurisdiction to the colonies and allowed for trials without juries in cases of piracy. Traditional English common law required 12 peers and a judge bound by precedent. Admiralty courts required only a panel of naval officers, a judge advocate, and a clerk to record the inevitable verdict. The accused had no right to counsel, no right to cross-examine witnesses, no presumption of innocence. These courts popped up wherever the Royal Navy dropped anchor. Spanish Town in Jamaica, Port Royal before the earthquake swallowed it in 1692, New Providence in the Bahamas, Charleston, Boston, Bardstown in Barbados. A captain could seize a suspected pirate vessel on Monday, convene a tribunal on Wednesday, and have bodies swinging from gibbets by Friday. The speed wasn't efficiency, it was policy. The empire needed shipping, lanes secure, and insurance premiums low. Every trial was a message written in blood and rope. This ocean belongs to the crown, and anyone who forgets that will hang until the tide takes them. For women, the system added layers of violence that had nothing to do with the evidence. A man in sailor's slops was unremarkable. A woman in the same clothing was an abomination against nature. Court records drip with language that reveals the real crime. Not theft, not murder, but the audacity of being female in a male space. One 1721 Jamaica deposition describes a captured woman as dressed in men's apparel, which she wore in defiance of modesty and God's ordinance. The piracy charge was almost secondary. The primary offense was existing wrong. Admiral Sir Nicholas Laws, who governed Jamaica during the golden age of piracy trials, kept meticulous records. His ledgers show that between 1718 and 1722, his courts processed over 300 piracy cases. Women appeared in fewer than 20, but their trials took longer, generated more paperwork, and drew larger crowds. Why? Because a woman on trial for piracy wasn't just a criminal. She was a cultural emergency. The scale of the British campaign against piracy in the Caribbean and Atlantic was staggering. Between 1716 and 1726, the Crown executed more than 400 pirates. Hangings happened in clusters, 10 men at a time, swinging from gallows built on tidal mudflats, so their bodies would be washed by 3 high tides before being cut down. This wasn't accidental geography. Admiralty law specified the location. The sea was both victim and witness, and the executed had to be married to it in death. Colonial governors competed to host the most efficient trials. A high body count meant you were serious about order. A slow body count meant you were soft on crime, and softness could cost you your posting. Women were rare in these executions, but their rarity made them more valuable as propaganda. When a woman was condemned, the broadsheets exploded. Printers in London and Kingston rushed out pamphlets with lurid illustrations. Women in tricorn hats, pistols in hand, skirts billowing as they swung cutlasses on blood-slicked decks. These images sold thousands of copies. They fed a public obsession with female transgression. The trials themselves became spectacles. Merchants closed their shops. Taverns emptied. People traveled for days to watch a woman be sentenced because it wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a morality play with a foregone conclusion, and they could not look away, not when the prisoner was dragged into the courtroom in chains, not when the judge-advocate read the charges in a voice flat as parchment, not when the woman, exhausted, half-starved, brutalized by weeks in a colonial jail, tried to speak and was told to hold her tongue unless asked a direct question. The crowd leaned in. They wanted to see if she would cry, if she would beg, if she would crack. The machinery of Admiralty justice moved in stages, and each stage had its own rituals of cruelty. First came the arrest. Pirates were usually taken at sea after a brief, brutal engagement. Royal Navy sloops were faster and better armed than most pirate vessels. Once a pirate ship struck its colors, the prisoners were shackled below decks and transported to the nearest port with Admiralty jurisdiction. The voyage could take days or weeks. Food was minimal, water was rationed. Women prisoners were often separated from the men, but separation didn't mean safety. It meant isolation. Records from HMS Greyhound, which captured Bartholomew Roberts' crew in 1722, note that 2 women aboard the pirate ship were placed in the aft hold under guard, given bread and water, and forbidden to speak to the men. One of those women, whose name appears only as Mary S. in the logbook, died of fever before the ship reached Cape Coast Castle. No trial, no record of burial, just a line in the ledger. Female prisoner expired, body committed to the sea. Upon arrival at port, the prisoners were transferred to local jails, and these were not the stone fortresses of European imagination. Colonial prisons were makeshift horrors, converted warehouses, damp cellars beneath courthouses, crumbling forts with walls that sweated in the tropical heat. Rats were everywhere. Dysentery and typhus spread like wildfire. The dead were often left among the living for hours or days before anyone bothered to remove them. Women held in these conditions faced additional threats. Guards had keys and impunity. Sexual violence wasn't an aberration, it was a feature. The trial itself was a formality designed to look like justice. The courtroom was usually a room in the governor's residence or a naval captain's cabin. No jury box, no witness stand. Just a long table where officers sat in uniform, a clerk scratching notes with a quill, and Marines at the door to prevent escape. The prosecution presented its case first, testimony from captured merchant captains, sailors who had been pressed into pirate service, and then rescued naval officers who had boarded the pirate vessel. These witnesses were coached, sometimes openly. A lieutenant might say, "I saw the accused fire upon His Majesty's ship," and the accused would have no way to challenge the claim. No defense counsel, no cross-examination, no rebuttal. When it was the defendant's turn to speak, the rules became a trap. Silence looked like guilt. Speech was interrupted. Denials were dismissed as lies. The only defense that ever worked for women was pleading the belly, claiming pregnancy. If a jury of matrons examined the prisoner and confirmed she was with child, the court would delay execution until after birth. This wasn't mercy. The Crown didn't want to execute 2 people for the price of 1, and it didn't want the bad optics of killing an infant in the womb. But delay wasn't pardon. Many women who successfully pled pregnancy died in jail before giving birth. Others were executed after delivery, their children handed off to poorhouses or sold as indentured servants. Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the most famous examples. Captured in October 1720 with Calico Jack Rackham's crew off the coast of Jamaica, they were tried in Spanish Town the following month. The transcript of their trial survives, and it's a masterclass in theatrical brutality. The charges included piracy, robbery, and wearing men's apparel with intent to deceive. Witnesses described them as fierce fighters who had cursed and shouted and fired muskets during raids. The prosecution made much of their clothing, calling it an offense against nature and decency. Both women pled pregnancy. A jury of 12 local matrons examined them and confirmed the claims. The executions were stayed. But here's where the story fractures. Mary Read died in prison 4 months later, likely from fever, though some accounts suggest complications from miscarriage. Her death was recorded in a single line. Mary read, "Pirate, deceased in custody, April 1721. No ceremony, no burial record." Anne Bonny disappeared from official records entirely. Some historians believe her wealthy father bought her release. Others think she died in prison, and the records were lost. A few romantic narratives claim she lived to old age under an assumed name in the Carolinas. The truth is, we don't know, and that erasure is its own kind of violence. What we do know is what happened to women who couldn't plead pregnancy or whose claims were rejected. Take Mary Critchett, tried in Williamsburg, Virginia. In 1729, she had been part of a gang of escaped convicts who seized a tobacco sloop off the Virginia Capes and used it to raid coastal plantations. The trial lasted half a day. The verdict was guilty. She was hanged 3 days later at the provincial gallows, her body left to rot in a gibbet cage as a warning to others. The Virginia Gazette reported the execution in 4 sentences. Her first name is spelled 3 different ways in surviving documents. That's how much her life mattered to the record. Flogging was another tool in the arsenal, and it was deployed with calculated sadism. The cat o' nine tails wasn't just a whip. It was 9 separate cords of braided leather, each tipped with a knot or a small metal barb. A dozen lashes could strip the skin off a person's back. 50 lashes meant permanent scarring and possible infection. 100 lashes could kill outright from shock and blood loss. Courts sentenced pirates to flogging as either a prelude to execution or as punishment for lesser offenses, theft, desertion, assault. For men, it was agony and humiliation. For women, it was that plus sexual degradation. The ritual was public. The prisoner was stripped to the waist and tied to a post or the mast of a ship. A naval boatswain or a professional flogger administered the lashes while a surgeon stood by to count and ensure the sentence was carried out fully. Crowds gathered. Children watched. Women fainted. The flogger would start slow, letting the anticipation build, then accelerate into a rhythm that turned flesh into pulp. Blood sprayed, skin peeled. The prisoner's screams became the soundtrack to imperial order. For female prisoners, the stripping was its own punishment. Exposing a woman's torso in public was a deliberate act of dehumanization. It said you have no modesty, no dignity, no right to privacy. Colonial newspapers described these floggings with voyeuristic glee. A 1726 account from Bridgetown, Barbados, notes that a woman convicted of piracy received 30 lashes at the cart's tail, her back laid bare to the waist, and bore the punishment without a tear, which astonished the assembled multitude. The writer isn't sympathetic. He's thrilled by the spectacle of female endurance, and they could not look away. Not from the blood, not from the flesh, not from the way a human body folds and breaks under systematic violence. Let's follow one woman through the entire machine, step by horrifying step. Her name was Rachel Wall, and though she operated in the North Atlantic rather than the Caribbean, her story maps onto the experiences of women tried under Admiralty law throughout the empire. Born in Pennsylvania in 1760, Rachel married a sailor named George Wall and moved to Boston. When George couldn't find work, the couple turned to piracy. Their method was clever. They'd sail out after a storm. Rachel would stand on deck pretending to be a shipwreck survivor, and when merchant vessels approached to offer aid, George and his crew would board them, kill the crew, and steal the cargo. They got away with it for 2 years. Then George drowned in an actual storm, and Rachel returned to Boston, working as a maid and occasionally as a thief. In 1789, she broke into a wealthy home on Beacon Hill, attacked a young woman, and stole her belongings. She was arrested, tried, and during interrogation, she confessed to her earlier piracy. The court was electrified. A female pirate hadn't been tried in Massachusetts in decades. The trial was held in October 1789 at the Court of Admiralty in Boston. Rachel had no lawyer. She was permitted to speak in her own defense, and she did calmly, methodically, explaining the economic desperation that had driven her and George to piracy. The judges listened politely. Then they sentenced her to death by hanging. The execution was set for October 8, 1789, at Boston Neck, a narrow spit of land where the gallows stood in view of the harbor. The morning of her execution, Rachel was loaded into a cart and paraded through the streets. Thousands lined the route. Children climbed trees for better view. Vendors sold meat pies and beer. It was a carnival, and she was the main attraction. At the gallows, she was given a chance to make a final statement. She spoke for 20 minutes, warning young women against the sins of disobedience and irreligion. The crowd loved it. Then the noose was placed around her neck. The cart pulled away, and she dropped. But here's the detail that haunts. They used a short drop. Her neck didn't break. She strangled slowly, legs kicking, body convulsing, for nearly 10 minutes before she finally went still. The crowd watched every second. Some cheered, some wept. Some just stared, unable to process the spectacle of a woman's death turned into public entertainment. Her body was left hanging for 3 hours, then cut down and buried in an unmarked grave. Rachel Wall was the last woman hanged for piracy in Massachusetts, but she wasn't the last woman punished for stepping outside the lines the law had drawn. The courts continued to process cases, the prisons continued to fill, and the gallows continued to do their work. The consequences rippled outward in ways that official records never captured. For families, the execution of a female pirate meant social annihilation. If a woman had children, they were often taken by the parish and placed in workhouses or sold as indentured servants. If she had a husband who survived, he was tainted by association. If she had parents, they were ostracized. The crime wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone connected to her. One 1718 letter from a Jamaican planter describes how his sister's conviction for piracy has brought such shame upon our family that I can no longer show my face in society. My daughters will never marry, my sons cannot find employment. She has destroyed us all. Public executions in port towns served as brutal warnings against autonomy. Women who dreamed of the sea, of escaping domestic confinement, saw those hopes crushed beneath gallows and chains. The message was clear: step out of line and your body becomes a spectacle of punishment. Yet a single document complicates this narrative. In the British Library sits a 1724 petition from 63 women in Kingston, Jamaica, pleading for mercy for Elizabeth Fowler, accused of aiding her husband in stealing merchant sloop. They argued she was coerced and that her execution would orphan 4 children. The governor refused, and Elizabeth was hanged 2 weeks later. Still, the petition reveals that even within systems designed to erase female agency, women fought back in the only ways they could. Today, the legacy of tortured and executed female pirates lingers in places, in museums that romanticize rebellion, in academic debates over whether figures like Anne Bonny were proto-feminists or criminals, in pop culture that dresses them in fantasy. But the real women, the ones whose names vanished from trial records, remain shadows. The paradox endures. The same empire that killed women for piracy relied on piracy to build power, legitimized by letters of marque women could never access. Stand on the dock. Hear the creak of the rope. The woman in the noose carries quiet defiance, and the question that echoes across time: was she ever free, or was the noose waiting from the start?